Remembrance Day ceremonies in Halifax, there was a peace rally in the downtown. About 100 people gathered in a park near the waterfront. They wanted to protest Canada's involvement in the Persian Gulf. Some in the crowd think Canadian warships have no business being in the Gulf at all. Others feel Canada's Navy should only be used in a blockade of Iraq. All agreed the United States appears to be headed into a war with Iraq, and Canada should not be dragged into it.
Sanctions, yes. The United Nations, yes. War, never.
Let's do something as Canadians. Let's protest and bring our brothers and sisters home for Christmas, alive, not in coffins.
Took a different twist today at the waterfront in Halifax as close to 100 people gathered to protest the presence of Canadian ships in the Persian Gulf. As Stark Cunningham tells us tonight, the message was clear: sanctions yes, war never.
Years old. I've never had to face the possibility of war before, and I'm scared.
Anti-war activists honored those who have died in battle and protested Canadian military involvement in the Middle East. The protesters strongly disagree with Prime Minister Mulroney and his sending of Canadian vessels without the consent of the people.
Let's protest and bring our brothers and sisters home for Christmas, alive, not in coffins.
The demonstration was organized by Debbie Bishop and April Brophy, two women who say they just realized something had to be done.
I think that we decided to do it because there was so much silence. No one has really spoken out against what's happening. I mean, we're faced with a war, like we're faced with the possibility of a war, and nobody has said anything yet, and we were just a little bit shocked about the whole thing.
The rally was not only attended by concerned citizens, but by physicians against nuclear war, children and veterans.
It's a remembrance partly of my friends who died. They didn't die for war to continue.
The overall goal here today is that the protesters' message will reach the ears of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and that thousands of Canadians will come together to protest the Canadian troops in the Gulf.
Children, sons.
Waterfront today is close to 100 people gathered to protest the presence of Canadian ships in the Persian Gulf. As Stark Cunningham tells us, the message was clear: sanctions yes, war never.
Years old. I've never had to face the possibility of war before, and I'm scared.
Anti-war activists honored those who have died in battle and protested Canadian military involvement in the Middle East. The protesters strongly disagree with Prime Minister Mulroney and his sending of Canadian vessels without the consent of the people.
Let's protest and bring our brothers and sisters home for Christmas, alive, not in coffins.
The demonstration was organized by Debbie Bishop and April Brophy, two women who say they just realized something had to be done.
I think that we decided to do it because there was so much silence. No one has really spoken out against what's happening. I mean, we're faced with a war, like we're faced with the possibility of a war, and nobody has said anything yet, and we were just a little bit shocked about the whole thing.
The rally was not only attended by concerned citizens, but by physicians against nuclear war, children and veterans.
It's a remembrance partly of my friends who died. They didn't die for war to continue.
The overall goal here today is that the protesters' message will reach the ears of Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and that thousands of Canadians will protest the Canadian troops in the Gulf. In Halifax, Stark Cunningham, ATV News.
We'll have
That wants to keep Canada out of a war in the Persian Gulf. Barbara Bateman has that story.
Fear and anger united a group of about 60 people who turned out for this Remembrance Day protest at the Halifax waterfront.
I'm 18 years old. I've never had to face the possibility of war before, and I'm scared. And I'm scared because there are people out there who aren't shocked about this war.
This demonstration was unusual. The people who organized it had never been involved in a demonstration before. They were just driven by their feeling that it's wrong to prepare for war in the Middle East. But the old hands of the peace movement were there to reinforce the message they've been sending all along. Canada shouldn't be risking war by meddling in other countries' business.
I'm angry. I'm angry because we haven't learned a damn thing. We're doing the same thing over again. Living in this port city in the end of August was like living a vignette of 1939 all over again.
But peace activist Gifford says things are very different this time because nuclear powers are lining up to intervene in the Gulf crisis.
As has already been described, war now means a form of total annihilation.
He says there are over 500 nuclear weapons in the U.S.-led Gulf Force already, and nobody's given any guarantee they won't use them.
I don't want to see Canada spoiling for a war, and I think it'll be a disaster if it comes. Possibly the worst disaster we've ever had yet.
The activists say they hope this weekend's demonstration will be the start of a movement aimed at keeping Canada out of a war for oil in the Persian Gulf.
Unless the public speaks up clearly to say we're not going to be fooled, there is an alternative to risking nuclear war, the powers that be will proceed.
In Halifax, Barbara Bateman, MITV.
War never.
We'll hear from both sides later.
For the first time in a generation, we remembered the sacrifices of some Canadians, while other Canadians are serving in a war zone.
With that, then you're just ready. Then when you got your automatic there, you just hold that down, bang, 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 and hope for the best.
And following the ceremony at the Cenotaph, an anti-war rally on the Halifax waterfront.
Let's protest and bring our brothers and sisters home for Christmas, alive, not in coffins.
I've never had to face the possibility of war before, and I'm scared. And I'm scared because there are people out there who aren't shocked about this war.
Sanctions, yes. The United Nations, yes. War never.
To talk to us about what's happening in the Gulf, I'm joined now by Brigadier General ALLAN McClellan. Welcome, General.
Thank you.
And by Gifford, who is with Veterans Against Nuclear War. Welcome, Mr. Gifford.
Glad to be with you.
Mr. Gifford, under no circumstances ought Canadians to fight in the Persian Gulf, you said this weekend. Why do you hold that view?
That's not quite what I said.
Well, clarify for me if you would.
I hold the view that if that we should be putting our energies now into preventing war, maintaining the sanctions but preventing war, because I think the possibility that nuclear weapons would be used would create such destruction there that it would be a far higher cost than anything that would be gained in war. Now, so that doesn't mean that Canadians wouldn't fight. If an iron cordon is put around Iraq, as I believe it should be under the United Nations, and if Mr. Hussein were to attack that, then Canadians should fight to keep him back. But that's quite different from trying to smash Baghdad or participate in that kind of war.
Okay. Would you hold that if the United Nations doesn't sanction military action, Canadians ought not to participate?
Exactly.
If something breaks out between Iraq and American troops, what would you have Canadians do?
I would have Canadians pull out, because I think that would probably be a first step towards a real disaster. A disaster for the people of the region, and it would contain the possibility that we'd have radioactive nuclear particles of sand going around in the atmosphere, falling all over the world.
General McClellan, can you imagine circumstances in which the Canadian vessels in the Persian Gulf would turn around and leave?
Yes, I think it's possible. It would depend on the circumstances. But I believe that they would have to fight if they were attacked. I think that's self-evident. Secondly, if the United Nations felt that the sanctions weren't working, then I think if the UN sanctioned the use of force to try to rectify the aggression, then I believe that Canada would have no choice but to fight along with.
What about the third case, though, which I think you're coming to? If the United Nations does not sanction military effort, but the Iraqis do something which annoys the American commander and it's underway, which is the fear that everybody has now.
Well, I don't think that it's likely that any war would start that way. Again, it would depend on the circumstances. If there were agreed action because the United Nations had failed, then I think it's conceivable that Canadian forces should fight in the Middle East. I think that right now the United Nations is on its greatest trial ever. If it succeeds in resolving that problem in a timely fashion, then I think the UN has a very, very bright future. But if the UN fails to solve that problem in the Middle East in a timely fashion, then I think we can say goodbye to the United Nations as an effective instrument for monitoring and controlling international action.
I think the problem of time, though, is that there seems to be this great military rush in there that is focusing on war, not on this business of tying Iraq up so that it can't be a danger to other people. It wants to destroy it so it can't be a danger. I think runs the risk that Israel will be destroyed, that Syria, that Lebanon will get into it, and so forth. And so far as I'm concerned, I'm willing to wait 3 years if necessary for the people of Iraq to decide that they have to get rid of Hussein the way the people in Eastern Europe have gotten rid of their leaders.
I wonder if we aren't a little late with this conversation, though. Hasn't it already gone beyond that? I mean, the tone that you seem to be getting from the United States and from the Gulf is that we're weeks or days away from a beginning of hostilities. Isn't that your feeling?
I wouldn't...
You're more hopeful than I am, perhaps.
I wouldn't leap out and say that. For one point is, how effective is our sanctions going to be? Thus far, they have not, I don't think, created the results that were hoped for.
Right.
And it's impossible to develop the iron ring that GIFF's talking about because, of course, you have Iran as part of that ring who is not terribly reliable in implementing the sanctions. You also have Jordan.
If it's not possible, then it's going to come to military action.
That's the way it looks at the moment, yes.
But on the other hand, we have this unprecedented unanimity about the sanctions in the Security Council. Even Cuba didn't vote against them. They abstained. And I think there's leverage to work on Lebanon and to work on Iran. And that's the kind of thing we should be doing.
Let me put one final question to you, though.
Sure.
You say there are circumstances in which the Canadians ought to turn around and get out of there.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen, is it? The Canadian government is committed to Canada participating in whatever happens over there, whether it's a war or something less than that.
That might be true, but if it's a war, I think it's going to be, it contains the possibility of being a worse tragedy for the world than World War II. And that's something I think we should put every effort to avoid.
There's risk in everything you do, and what we're saying is, are we going to sacrifice Kuwait because of the risk that we may have unforeseen results? And of course, that's going back to Munich.
I'm sorry, gentlemen, to do such a complex subject in such a short time, but I thank you both very much.
You're most welcome.
People from Labrador angry with low-level military flights over their territory. The demonstrators tried to block people from going to work inside the National Defense Building. Police moved in quickly and began dragging the protesters away. At one point, protesters splattered the building with human blood collected from volunteers. They say the low-level military flights threaten the Innu way of life because the jets frighten caribou and other traditional game. Police charged about 120 people with mischief.